then if somebody comes to me and says, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't take Genesis the way you do, then before you can even use arguments like that, we have to say, why don't you? Or I believe it's poetic. Well, okay, then I need to talk to them more about, okay, how did Jesus look at Genesis? What about Paul? What about Peter? Let's look at their quotes. For instance, Jesus talking about marriage in Matthew 19. Haven't you read? He made them male and female, said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave unto his wife, they'll be one flesh. And so Jesus is quoted from Genesis, this historical narrative, as he did in Mark 10 as well, and uses that as a foundation for those doctrines. So if that's just poetic, then it's not historical narrative, then what do you do with how Jesus takes Genesis, or Paul in Romans 5, or 1 Corinthians 15, or whatever it happens to be?
But knowing when to isolate instances of Scripture, well, when is it speaking in metaphor and when is it not? For example, I submit to you it's not enough to merely nest a particular verse, whether it's historical or not. That's not enough, because in the same historical narrative of Genesis, you have Genesis 3 saying that Adam and Eve heard the sound of God walking in the cool of the day in the garden. And I had to call my brother, who's the Hebrew scholar in my life. Everyone should have a Hebrew scholar in their life. If you don't have one, try to see if you can get one of your siblings or something to become a Hebrew scholar. So I just call him up and go, because I realized, well, that in the English it seems kind of ambiguous. It says Adam and Eve heard the sound of God walking in the cool of the day. I thought, well, it's Adam and Eve walking when they heard the sound of God? Or were they hearing God and God was walking? Because it seemed kind of unclear to me in the English, so I called Tom up. I said, hey, what's going on in the Hebrew? He said, no, it's not ambiguous. It's God is walking in the garden. Now, I asked a friend of mine at church, I said, well, do you believe God has legs? He said, no. I knew he didn't. I was using him as a sounding board. No, I don't believe God has legs. I said, well, it says in Genesis 3, he's walking in the garden. You can't walk without legs. So you got to have legs. Why don't you believe God has legs? He said, well, because John 4, Jesus said God is spirit. So them that worship him in spirit and truth. So he can't have legs. I said, so what do you do with the Genesis 3 passage? He said, well, I take that as a figure of speech. I said, how do you know the John 4 passage isn't a figure of speech? You're assuming without argument that when it said God has legs, that's a metaphor, but when Jesus said God is spirit, that's literal. How do you know when Jesus said God is spirit, that's not metaphor, and when the narrative, historical, says that God is walking, that's literal? I said, after all, when Paul tells the Galatians in Galatians 6:1, brethren, if any among you are overtaken in a fault, let they who are spiritual among you go and restore him. Well, he obviously wasn't meaning that the elders come floating down that they're immaterial elders and they come floating down. Who's that sinner in our church? There he is. Let's get him, boys. And then they rebuke him and then they float back up to the church office. He obviously didn't mean by being spiritual that they were immaterial. So we know the Bible sometimes uses spiritual and doesn't mean immaterial. In fact, when it talks about the resurrected body, it describes it as a spiritual body. We know that's not immaterial because Jesus rose physically from the dead. He had breakfast with the disciples. So I go, okay, so something more has got to come into play here than just merely something like, well, it's historical narrative, therefore it's literal.